July 1944, and the rubble-choked streets of Caen stretch empty under afternoon haze, where smoke from burning buildings drifts across shattered stone walls, and a lone panzer grenadier named Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann crawls forward through debris, carrying what appears to be an oversized metal canister with 3 conical legs protruding from its base and magnetic pads affixed to those legs. And he moves with agonizing slowness, because 30 meters ahead, an American M4 Sherman tank sits idling, with its engine rumbling and turret traversing, slowly scanning for targets. And Hartmann knows that if the crew spots movement, he dies instantly from the coaxial machine gun or the hull-mounted Browning. But he also knows that his unit needs this intersection cleared, and the tank blocking it must die. And conventional Panzerfaust launchers have already failed, because the Sherman is positioned hull down behind a collapsed building with only its turret exposed, making a frontal shot impossible. And so Hartmann accepted what his squad leader called a volunteer mission, though everyone understood it was really a death sentence with perhaps 20% survival odds. And he carries the Hafthohlladung Model 3 magnetic anti-tank mine weighing 3 kilograms and containing enough shaped charge explosive to penetrate 140 millimeters of armor plate at 0 degrees angle, which means it can kill any Allied tank from any position if he can just reach it without being seen in place. And the magnets against the hull and pull the friction igniter and sprint 15 meters before the 4.5-second fuse detonates. And the thing that makes this weapon both brilliant and horrifying is that it requires no aiming, no trajectory calculation, no ballistic computation, just physical contact between magnet and steel, and the courage or desperation or madness to crawl within arm's reach of a 40-ton machine designed to kill infantry. The strategic predicament confronting German forces throughout 1943 and 1944 stemmed from a brutally simple mathematics problem where Allied material superiority produced 5 tanks for every 1 Germany manufactured, and those tanks operated with near impunity because conventional German anti-tank weapons either lacked sufficient penetration against upgraded Allied armor or required firing positions that exposed the operator to immediate retaliation, and the Panzerfaust 60 could destroy a Sherman at 60 meters. But that range meant the tank's machine guns could suppress the firing position, and the Panzerschreck required a 2-man team and produced a massive backblast signature that revealed the shooter's location instantly, and heavier weapons like the POC-40 anti-tank gun were excellent when properly emplaced, but weighed over 1,000 kilograms and could not be repositioned quickly in fluid urban combat, and German armored forces that might counter Allied tanks were increasingly concentrated on the Eastern Front fighting Soviet offensives, while the Western Front received whatever scraps remained, and infantry units found themselves defending cities and fortified positions against Allied armor without adequate means to destroy it. And the engineers at various Wehrmacht ordnance facilities recognized that conventional anti-tank doctrine assumed defenders possessed mobility and firepower advantages that no longer existed, and what German infantry actually needed was something cheap, portable, universally effective, and simple enough that any soldier could employ it even in the chaos of close-quarters urban warfare, where tanks often operated beyond the effective range of their supporting infantry. Early attempts to address this vulnerability included magnetic anti-tank mines, like the Haftmine Model 13, which contained a smaller 1.3 kilogram charge, and produced inconsistent results because the magnetic attachment often failed on muddy or dusty tank surfaces, and the explosive force proved insufficient against thicker armor, especially when placed on sloped surfaces where the blast dissipated at angles. And combat reports from Stalingrad and other urban battles documented cases where soldiers placed these mines on Soviet T-34 tanks, only to watch them slide off or detonate without penetrating the armor. And American forces deployed various explosive charges, including the M1A1 Bangalore torpedo for obstacle clearance and the M3 demolition charge for fortifications. But neither was optimized for anti-tank use, and the Bangalore required assembly of multiple sections making it unwieldy in combat. And the M3 charge lacked the focused penetration necessary to breach armor plate, and British forces experimented with sticky bombs officially designated as the number 74 grenade, which used adhesive compound to attach to tank surfaces. But these proved disastrously unreliable because the adhesive often stuck to the thrower's uniform or failed to adhere to dusty surfaces. And the blast radius was small enough that the explosive force rarely achieved kills, and Soviet infantry doctrine emphasized close assault using bundled anti-tank grenades or Molotov cocktails against vision ports and engine gratings, which occasionally worked through secondary fires, but required multiple soldiers exposing themselves to machine gun fire while approaching. And none of these solutions addressed the core engineering challenge, which was delivering sufficient explosive force precisely perpendicular to armor plate at the point of maximum vulnerability. The breakthrough emerged from development work conducted at the Wehrmacht Weapons Office Heereswaffenamt in Berlin, where engineers under the direction of weapons designer Dr. Heinrich Langweiler, who had previously worked on shaped charge munitions for the Luftwaffe, examined the Munroe effect, discovered by American scientist Charles Munroe in 1888, which demonstrated that explosives with a conical hollow cavity focused detonation energy into a high-velocity jet capable of penetrating armor, far exceeding the charge's diameter. And Langweiler's team developed a cone-line-shaped charge using copper as the liner material because copper possessed the optimal combination of density, malleability, and melting point to form a coherent jet under explosive compression. And the critical innovation involved calculating the precise standoff distance between the charge cone and the target surface, because positioning the cone too close or too far from the target degraded penetration. And after extensive testing at the Kummersdorf Proving Ground, south of Berlin, the engineers determined that 75 millimeters of standoff produced maximum penetration for a charge containing 1.5 kilograms of TNT and PETN explosive mixture. And to maintain this precise distance, they designed 3 hollow steel legs that positioned the charge cone exactly 75 millimeters from the tank surface when the magnetic pads contacted metal, and the magnets themselves were neodymium iron boron compounds capable of generating 40 kilograms of holding force, ensuring the device remained attached even on vertical surfaces or inverted positions. And complete assembly measured 210 millimeters in diameter, weighed 3 kilograms, and contained 1,500 grams of fill pulver 02 explosive composition, which was a mixture of 60% TNT and 40% PETN that provided detonation velocity of 7,500 meters per second. And the friction igniter used a pull wire mechanism that scraped a roughened rod against a pyrotechnic compound, creating sparks that ignited a delay element burning for 4.5 seconds before detonating the main charge. And this delay gave the operator just enough time to sprint clear of the blast radius, which extended approximately 15 meters with lethal fragmentation. When deployed in combat, the Hafthohlladung required the combat operator to first approach the target tank while remaining undetected, which usually meant crawling through rubble or using smoke cover or attacking from concealed positions. And once within reach, he would remove the protective cap covering the magnetic pads and position the device against the hull or turret, typically targeting areas where armor was thinnest, including rear hull plates, engine deck sides, or turret ring joints, and the magnets engaged with an audible clunk that could be heard inside the tank if crew members were not distracted by engine noise or combat sounds. And immediately after placement, the soldier pulled the friction igniter cord, withdrawing it completely from the body, which activated the 4.5-second delay fuse and then sprinted toward cover. And upon detonation, the shaped charge created a copper jet traveling at approximately 8,000 meters per second, with temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius, which meant the jet existed in a semi-liquid plasma state. And when this jet contacted armor plate, it did not drill through in the conventional sense, but rather behaved like a high-pressure fluid, penetrating through plastic deformation and hydrodynamic flow. And, against the Sherman's 50mm side hull armor, the jet would penetrate completely, creating an entry hole approximately 40 millimeters in diameter. And once inside the crew compartment, the jet retained sufficient energy to perforate internal components, ammunition racks, fuel cells, and crew members. And the secondary effects included spalling, where fragments of the inner armor surface broke away and ricocheted through the compartment at supersonic velocities, and overpressure waves that ruptured organs and eardrums, and in most cases the tank did not explode cinematically, but rather suffered catastrophic mission kill, where the crew either died instantly or evacuated immediately, leaving the vehicle smoking and immobile. And this outcome was actually preferable to explosions, because it meant the tank remained intact for salvage, while the psychological impact on surviving crew members was devastating. In August 1944, during the Falaise pocket battles, Kampfgruppe Weidinger of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich deployed Hafthohlladung teams against American armor, attempting to close the encirclement, and combat reports filed by Hauptsturmführer Otto Weidinger documented at least 7 Sherman kills attributed to magnetic mines within a 3-day period, where German infantry infiltrated forward positions during pre-dawn hours and attached charges to tanks that had lagered overnight without adequate infantry security. And one particularly detailed account describes Unterscharführer Ernst Bauer approaching AD.O. Sherman at 0430 hours on August 19, near Trun, and placing the charge on the engine deck above the fuel tanks, and the subsequent detonation ignited stored gasoline, creating a catastrophic fire that consumed the vehicle completely. And American after-action reports from the 90th Infantry Division noted, quote, increasing incidents of German infantry suicide attacks against armored vehicles using magnetic explosive devices, requiring enhanced security protocols and infantry screening at all static positions, unquote. And, at Monte Cassino in January 1944, German Fallschirmjäger paratroopers used Hafthohlladung against British Churchill tanks, attempting to advance through the rubble-choked monastery approaches, and the confined terrain and abundant cover allowed German assault engineers to approach within throwing distance, and several Churchills were immobilized by charges placed on tracks and suspension components. And in urban combat at Aachen, during October 1944, American forces reported that German defenders were using, quote, magnetic pot mines, unquote, that required tanks to maintain constant movement and avoid static positions, and infantry squads had to physically inspect all vehicles every 30 minutes to ensure no charges had been attached. And this defensive adaptation significantly slowed American advances, because tanks operating without infantry support became vulnerable, and infantry moving ahead of tanks exposed themselves to small arms fire. If you are finding this examination of desperate German anti-tank innovation compelling, subscribing helps this channel continue exploring the obscure weapons that emerged when conventional military doctrine collapsed under material disadvantage. The psychological warfare aspect of the Hafthohlladung proved as significant as its kinetic effects, because Allied tank crews developed acute anxiety about infantry approaching their vehicles, especially during urban operations or night defensive positions, and standard operating procedures evolved to require constant vigilance, with at least one crew member maintaining external observation even during maintenance halts. And many crews welded additional mesh screening called Cullen hedgerow cutters to hull surfaces, ostensibly for cutting through Norman bocage hedgerows. But these screens also prevented magnetic mines from contacting hull armor directly, and eliminated the standoff distance necessary for shape charge effectiveness. And some tank commanders ordered their crews to never park within 50 meters of buildings or rubble piles that could conceal infiltrating infantry. And several documented cases exist where Sherman crews abandoned perfectly functional tanks after hearing metallic sounds that they believed indicated magnetic mine attachment, even when no actual device was present. And post-battle stress evaluations conducted by U.S. Army medical personnel noted elevated anxiety levels among armored crew members who had operated in urban environments where magnetic mine attacks occurred, and this psychological attrition degraded combat effectiveness even when no actual attacks materialized. Allied intelligence first documented the Hafthohlladung in December 1943, when British forces recovered intact examples from destroyed German positions near Ortona, Italy, and the devices were immediately shipped to the Ministry of Supply Research Facility at Fort Halstead in Kent, where explosive ordnance disposal specialists conducted detailed examinations, and British Technical Intelligence Report, MI-10, 3847, filed in January 1944, described the weapon as, quote, a sophisticated shaped charge device, demonstrating advanced understanding of Munroe effect principles, and representing a significant threat to all Allied armor types, when employed by determined infantry at close range, unquote, and comparative testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland during March 1944, subjected various Allied tanks to captured Hafthohlladung units, and results confirmed that the 3-kilogram charge could penetrate 140 millimeters of armor at 0 degrees angle, which exceeded the protection levels of Sherman side hull armor at 50 millimeters, Churchill side armor at 76 millimeters, and even the frontal armor of many light tanks. And American ordnance engineers noted that the magnetic attachment system was considerably more reliable than British sticky bomb designs, and the shape charge penetration far exceeded anything in the U.S. inventory, and recommendations included developing countermeasures such as non-magnetic hull coatings or spaced armor panels. But these modifications were deemed too expensive and time-consuming for field implementation, and instead, tactical doctrine emphasized infantry armor cooperation and constant vehicle movement in contested areas, and Soviet forces captured substantial quantities of Hafthohlladung during the 1944 offensives, and immediately reverse-engineered the design, producing domestic variants including the RPG-43 hand-delivered anti-tank grenade, which borrowed the shaped charge cone configuration, though it used a different delivery method, and post-war Soviet anti-tank doctrine incorporated close assault tactics using shaped charge weapons directly influenced by German magnetic mine employment. Production of the Hafthohlladung commenced in late 1942 at multiple facilities, including the Dynamit Nobel explosives plants at Tropen and the Rheinmetall Borsig works near Dusseldorf, with final assembly occurring at small workshops throughout Germany to disperse manufacturing against Allied bombing, and total production between 1,942 and 1,945 exceeded 550,000 units, according to Wehrmacht quartermaster records, preserved in Bundesarchiv files BAMARH 12-2347, and production costs were remarkably low at approximately 12 Reichsmarks per unit compared to 300 Reichsmarks for a Panzerfaust launcher, making the Reichsmarks for a Panzerfaust launcher. Magnetic mine, one of the most cost-effective anti-tank weapons in German service and combat expenditure records, suggest approximately 60% of manufactured units reached front-line units, with the remainder lost to Allied bombing of supply depots or destroyed during retreat operations, and surviving examples exist in museum collections, including the Imperial War Museum London, which holds 2 intact Hafthohlladung Model 3 units recovered from Normandy, and the Deutsches Panzermuseum Munster, which displays both the 3-kilogram Model 3 and the larger 3.5-kilogram Model 3.5 variant, that entered limited production in late 1944, with enhanced penetration capabilities, and the United States Army Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen Proving Ground maintains several examples acquired during post-war technical intelligence operations, and the engineering principles pioneered in the Hafthohlladung influenced post-war anti-tank weapon development across multiple nations, including American research into shaped charge warheads for guided missiles, and Soviet development of rocket-propelled grenades, and Israeli military engineers studying captured German weapons after World War II incorporated shaped charge principles into anti-tank weapons that eventually evolved into modern systems still in service today. The effectiveness assessment of the Hafthohlladung depends on whether one measures absolute kill counts or strategic impact, and in terms of verified tank destructions, the magnetic mine accounted for perhaps 2 to 3% of total German anti-tank kills because the requirement, approach within arm's reach, limited employment opportunities, and resulted in high operator casualties. And most anti-tank kills were achieved by conventional guns mines, or Panzerfaust launchers, operating at safer standoff distances. But the strategic impact far exceeded these modest numbers, because the mere existence of magnetic mines forced Allied armored forces to adopt defensive protocols that reduced operational tempo and required additional infantry support, and degraded the effectiveness of tank operations in urban terrain, where magnetic mine threats were highest. And German defensive planning in 1944 and 1945 relied heavily on channeling Allied armor into urban kill zones, where conventional anti-tank weapons could engage from prepared positions, while infantry assault teams armed with Hafthohlladung attacked from concealed positions. And this combined arms approach achieved local successes that delayed Allied advances and inflicted casualties disproportionate to German resource investment. And the weapon represented the terminal logic of German anti-tank doctrine, where material inferiority forced acceptance of high-risk close assault tactics that conventional military theory would reject as suicidal, but desperation rendered acceptable when the alternative was watching Allied armor operate unopposed. July 1944, and Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann reaches the Sherman's hull, and his hands shake as he removes the protective cap and positions the magnetic pads against the engine deck, and the magnets engage with that telltale clunk, and he pulls the friction igniter and runs. And inside the tank, the crew commander hears something metallic, but dismisses it as debris settling. And 4.5 seconds later, the shaped charge detonates, and the copper jet penetrates the thin engine deck armor, and ignites fuel vapors in the engine compartment, and flames pour from the engine grills, and the crew bails out through hatches, and Hartmann watches from a crater 30 meters away as 5 Americans scramble clear and run toward their lines. And the Sherman sits burning, and Hartmann survives this mission, though he will die 3 weeks later during another close assault against a different tank. And that was the Hafthohlladung, in a single moment where German ingenuity and Allied industrial might collided in rubble-choked streets, and desperate men crawled toward machines carrying bombs they would place by hand because that was the only option remaining. And engineering excellence could not change the fundamental equation that Germany was losing, but it could make the losing slower and costlier and more psychologically scarring for everyone involved. And that metal flower pot with magnets represented what warfare becomes when one side has everything except enough, and the other side must find ways to make courage and proximity substitute for firepower and resources. And the soldiers who carried them knew they were probably going to die, but they carried them anyway, because the alternative was certain defeat. And at least this way, there was a chance, however small, of taking an enemy tank with them. And that was German anti-tank warfare in 1944, where the most advanced shaped charge engineering in the world was delivered to targets by men crawling through rubble, because there was no other way left.